Judge Irma Roos, you took an oath to uphold justice, yet you perverted it into a tool for murder. For 7 counts of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You believed yourself above the law. Today proves no one is. 58-year-old Judge Irma Roos, a distinguished circuit court judge, systematically hunted and murdered 7 individuals by staging their deaths as suicides, accidents, and overdoses over a calculated 3-year killing spree. The victims had all appeared in her courtroom and received outcomes she privately deemed inadequate: acquittals, dismissed charges, or lenient plea bargains that left her seething with rage behind her composed judicial mask. Colleagues would later recall seeing Judge Roos in her signature crimson blazer, presiding over cases with her trademark intensity, while case files were meticulously organized on the mahogany desk of chambers she had occupied for over 2 decades. What appeared to be the dedicated work of a passionate jurist concealed a horrifying reality that would only come to light when Detective Marcia Hendricks discovered a single trace of rare industrial solvent at multiple crime scenes, a chemical found exclusively in the courthouse document preservation laboratory. The breaking point came 3 years earlier, when Judge Roos was forced to dismiss murder charges against Marcus Webb due to an evidence collection violation. 2 weeks later, when Webb assaulted another victim, something inside the respected judge fractured beyond repair. Webb became her first correction, found hanging in his apartment in what police ruled a suicide. Before we dive deeper into this shocking case of judicial corruption and vigilante murder, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. Judge Irma Roos didn't start as a monster. She started as the kind of judge defense attorneys feared and prosecutors loved. For 25 years, she walked the marble halls of the city's busiest courthouse, wearing those striking crimson blazers that became her signature, her heels clicking with the authority of someone who genuinely believed she was making the world safer, one verdict at a time. She'd mentored young lawyers, sat on judicial ethics committees, and delivered speeches about the sacred responsibility of the bench. But behind that polished facade, something was rotting from the inside out. The turning point came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when she was forced to dismiss murder charges against Marcus Webb, a case she'd spent weeks preparing to oversee. The evidence was solid. The victim's family was in the gallery waiting for justice. But a Fourth Amendment violation meant everything prosecutors had built came crashing down on a technicality. Judge Roos maintained her composure on the bench, her face an unreadable mask as she declared the charges dismissed. But those who knew her well noticed the white-knuckle grip on her gavel, the slight tremor in her voice when she said those final words, releasing Webb back onto the streets. What happened next in her chambers that afternoon would set 7 people on a path toward death they couldn't possibly have seen coming. Her law clerk found her staring at the wall, still in that crimson blazer, repeating the same phrase over and over. The system failed. When the clerk tried to console her, reminding her that constitutional protections sometimes mean guilty people go free, Judge Roos turned with eyes that carried a frightening new conviction and said something that should have raised every red flag imaginable. Then, the system needs correction. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb was arrested again, this time for a brutal assault that left another victim hospitalized. The news hit Judge Roos's desk through the same court filing system she'd used for decades, and according to digital records later recovered by investigators, she spent the next 72 hours obsessively researching everything about Webb's life: his address, his routine, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She accessed sealed juvenile records she had no legal right to view, pulled his probation reports, even found his social media accounts through connections that raised questions about what other boundaries she'd been crossing. 3 weeks after that assault arrest, Marcus Webb was found hanging in his apartment, an apparent suicide that closed the case as far as the responding officers were concerned. The investigating detective noted that Webb had been facing serious charges and had a history of depression, making suicide tragically plausible. The case was filed away, and nobody, not prosecutors, not defense attorneys, not even Webb's own family, suspected that the woman in the crimson blazer had just committed her first murder. But in a leather-bound journal hidden behind law books in her chambers, Judge Irma Roos made her first entry in what she titled Corrections. System failed, I did not. Marcus Webb's death was just the beginning. But for 3 years, nobody connected the dots because Judge Irma Rose was meticulous in ways that would have impressed even the most seasoned homicide detective. She varied her methods like she was working through a textbook on staged deaths. One victim found with a fatal overdose of prescription painkillers, another in what appeared to be a tragic car accident on a rain-slicked highway, a third discovered at the bottom of his apartment stairwell with injuries consistent with a drunken fall. Each death stood alone, unremarkable, in a city where people died every day from overdoses, accidents, and misfortune. But Detective Marcia Hendricks had been working cold cases for 15 years, and she'd developed an instinct for patterns that others missed. It started with a routine review of unsolved deaths from the past 3 years, cases that had been closed as accidents or suicides, but never quite sat right with the investigating officers. Hendricks spread 7 case files across her desk in the cramped detective bureau, studying crime scene photos and autopsy reports while dispatch calls echoed through the hallway outside her office. 5 men, 2 women, ages ranging from 24 to 53, scattered across different neighborhoods, from the gentrified downtown lofts to the working-class suburbs where chain-link fences divided tiny yards. Nothing obvious connected them. Different races, different backgrounds, different causes of death. But Hendricks had learned to trust her gut, and something about these cases whispered that they weren't as random as they appeared. The breakthrough came from forensic evidence that had been sitting in evidence lockers for months, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. A sharp-eyed lab technician named Rodriguez had noticed something unusual during a routine quality check of old samples. Trace amounts of an industrial chemical showing up in evidence from 3 different death scenes. The chemical was hexafluoroisopropanol, a solvent so specialized that Rodriguez had to look it up in a chemistry database to even understand what it was used for. Legal document preservation, specifically the kind of high-end archival work done in courthouse preservation laboratories where historical records and sensitive legal documents were treated to prevent deterioration. Hendricks felt her pulse quicken as she read Rodriguez's report. She immediately pulled the other 4 case files and requested retrospective testing on any remaining physical evidence. 3 weeks later, the results came back positive. All 7 victims had trace amounts of hexafluoroisopropanol on their clothing, their personal effects, or at the death scenes. The concentration levels were minimal, the kind of thing that could be transferred through incidental contact, but the pattern was undeniable. Whoever killed these 7 people had regular access to a courthouse document preservation lab, and that narrowed the suspect pool from millions of potential killers down to maybe 24 courthouse employees who even knew such facilities existed, let alone had clearance to access them after hours. Detective Hendricks didn't waste time once she understood what that chemical signature meant. She pulled the court records for all 7 victims, a process that took her team 3 days of cross-referencing case numbers, docket entries, and archived files that hadn't been digitized yet. What emerged from those dusty records sent a chill down her spine that she'd remember for the rest of her career. Every single victim had appeared in court within the previous 6 months before their death. But here's where it got even more disturbing. They hadn't just appeared in any courtroom. All 7 had stood before the same judge, received favorable outcomes that let them walk free, and then died under mysterious circumstances within 2 to 8 weeks of those proceedings. Judge Irma Rouse's name appeared on every single case file like a signature at a crime scene. A domestic abuser who'd gotten a plea deal to probation, dead from an apparent overdose 6 weeks later. A DUI defendant whose charges were dismissed on a technicality, killed in a single car accident 3 weeks after walking out of her courtroom. A sexual assault suspect acquitted by a jury despite compelling evidence, found dead at the bottom of his stairs 4 weeks later. The pattern was so clear it seemed impossible that nobody had noticed it before. But that's the thing about judges. They see thousands of defendants every year, and most people don't track what happens to those defendants after they leave the courtroom. If you're finding this story as shocking as we are, please hit that subscribe button and join our community who believe in exposing corruption no matter where it hides. We're building something special here, a space where we can discuss these cases that challenge everything we thought we knew about justice. Your support helps us continue investigating stories that need to be told. Hendricks knew she was onto something explosive, but courthouse access logs would be the key to proving it. She submitted a formal request through the court administrator's office for 3 years of security records, showing who had entered the document preservation laboratory during off hours. The request triggered immediate pushback. Judges had broad access to courthouse facilities, and the administration was understandably reluctant to hand over records that might implicate one of their own. It took a direct order from the district attorney and a narrowly crafted warrant before those logs finally landed on Hendrix's desk, and what she found there was damning beyond anything she'd imagined. Judge Irma Rouse had accessed the preservation lab 43 times over 3 years, always after hours when the building was nearly empty, always within 2 weeks before one of her victims died. The lab technician who managed the facility confirmed that judges occasionally used the space for preserving personal legal documents or sensitive case materials, so her presence wasn't inherently suspicious. But 43 visits? That wasn't normal judicial behavior. That was the routine of someone using courthouse resources for purposes the Founding Fathers never intended when they granted judicial independence. The access logs gave Detective Hendrix probable cause, but she needed more than suspicious timing to get a warrant for a sitting judge's chambers. That's when she brought in the forensic team to re-examine every piece of physical evidence from the 7 crime scenes with fresh eyes and a new theory. What they discovered was a masterclass in how someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures could almost, but not quite, commit the perfect crimes. At the scene where victim number 3 had supposedly overdosed on painkillers, forensic analysts found microscopic traces of hexafluoroisopropanol on the prescription bottle itself, as if someone wearing gloves, contaminated with the chemical, had handled it. At the accidental car crash site, the same chemical showed up on the driver's side door handle, suggesting someone had tampered with the vehicle before the fatal drive. But the real smoking gun came from Judge Rouse's own courthouse chambers, when Hendrix finally secured that warrant after weeks of legal maneuvering that went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. The search had to be conducted during a weekend when the courthouse was closed to avoid the media circus that would erupt if word got out that investigators were searching a judge's private office. What they found hidden behind leather-bound volumes of legal precedents was a journal that read like something from a psychological thriller, meticulous entries documenting each victim's crimes against morality and detailed justifications for why their deaths served a higher purpose than the law could provide. The journal entries were chilling in their clinical detachment. Victim number 4, a domestic abuser named Robert Chen, who'd accepted a plea bargain, Judge Rouse was forced to approve. The bruises on his wife's face cry out for true justice. The system gave him probation. I will give him what he deserves. Victim number 6, a repeat DUI offender whose charges were dismissed on a technicality. How many more will die from his recklessness before the law stops protecting him? I am the last line of defense between evil and society. Each entry was dated, cross-referenced with court case numbers, and included technical notes about methodology that revealed she'd been researching how to stage deaths to appear accidental or self-inflicted. But it wasn't just the journal that sealed her fate. Forensic IT specialists who examined her personal laptop found she'd been using encrypted communication channels to contact someone described only as the consultant, messages that discuss surveillance techniques, how to avoid leaving forensic evidence, and methods for making deaths appear natural. Financial records subpoenaed from her bank accounts revealed she'd been paying this mysterious consultant through an offshore account, with transactions totaling over $340,000 over 3 years. The prosecution would later argue this proved premeditation and sophisticated planning, not the actions of someone who'd simply snapped under the pressure of judicial frustration. The surveillance equipment discovered hidden in her chambers was perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all. A system sophisticated enough to monitor court security cameras, track case assignments, and even access sealed defendant information that judges technically had clearance to view, but never should have used for personal purposes. The surveillance equipment told investigators that Judge Rouse hadn't just been monitoring courthouse security systems. She'd been tracking her victims with the precision of someone who'd spent decades analyzing evidence and understanding exactly what police would look for during investigations. Hidden cameras disguised as everyday office items captured timestamps showing she'd been watching defendants as they left the courthouse, noting which exits they used, which parking lots they headed toward, even which bus routes they took home. One particular video file, recovered from an encrypted folder labeled Case Review, showed her following victim number 5 through downtown streets at a distance that suggested professional surveillance training. Her crimson blazer swapped for a nondescript gray hoodie that made her nearly invisible in the urban landscape. But the digital evidence went even deeper than anyone initially suspected. Forensic analysts discovered she'd been using her judicial access to law enforcement databases to pull home addresses, vehicle registrations, and even sealed juvenile records that gave her psychological profiles of her victims. She knew their weaknesses, their addictions, their fears. Information she weaponized to stage deaths that investigators would instinctively categorize as consistent with each victim's personal history. The domestic abuser had a known drinking problem, so his overdose seemed plausible. The sexual assault suspect had attempted suicide years earlier, so his fatal fall appeared tragically predictable. She'd studied these people like a prosecutor prepares for trial, except her closing argument was murder. The offshore account raised even more disturbing questions about how long she'd been planning this double life. Financial forensics experts traced the account to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under a name that seemed randomly generated, but used an IP address that pinged back to Judge Roos's home computer. Over 3 years, she'd been funneling money into this account through a series of transactions designed to stay just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting requirements. Some of the deposits came from what appeared to be legitimate consulting work she'd been doing for law firms on complex cases. But other transfers had no clear source, and investigators suspected they might be connected to the mysterious consultant she'd been paying for surveillance expertise. Her internet search history painted the picture of someone who understood she was crossing a line from which there was no return and was planning for the possibility of eventually needing to disappear. She'd researched countries without extradition treaties with the United States, with particular focus on those that offered residency to individuals with professional credentials like her law degree. Brazil, Russia, and several Middle Eastern nations appeared frequently in her browsing history, along with searches about how to establish new identities and whether plastic surgery could defeat facial recognition software. One particularly chilling search from 6 months before her arrest asked, "Can forensic science detect judicial immunity from prosecution?" The psychological profile that emerged from all this evidence showed a woman who'd convinced herself she was operating within some higher moral authority that transcended the laws she'd sworn to uphold. Detective Hendricks knew the arrest had to be executed with absolute precision, because they were taking down someone who understood the criminal justice system better than most defense attorneys. The decision was made to arrest Judge Irma Rouse in her courtroom during an active hearing, a strategic choice that would prevent any possibility of her claiming later that evidence had been planted or that she'd been denied due process. On a Thursday morning, while she was presiding over a routine motion hearing, Hendricks walked through the heavy oak doors with 6 uniformed officers, warrant in hand, and approached the bench where Judge Roos sat in that signature crimson blazer that had become synonymous with her authority. The courtroom fell silent as Hendricks announced the warrant loud enough for the court reporter to capture every word. Judge Rouse's first reaction wasn't shock or fear. It was indignation that carried the weight of 25 years on the bench. She actually tried to hold court, demanding to know by what authority Hendricks was interrupting judicial proceedings and whether the detective understood she could be held in contempt. But Hendricks had anticipated this reaction and calmly explained that the warrant had been signed by a federal judge specifically to avoid any conflicts with the local judiciary, and that Judge Rouse needed to step down from the bench immediately. The bailiff, a man who'd worked in that courtroom for 12 years, stood frozen between his loyalty to the judge he'd served and his duty to law enforcement until Hendricks made it clear this wasn't optional. The reading of the charges, 7 counts of first-degree murder, echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for judicial integrity. Attorneys in the gallery pulled out their phones to text colleagues. Defendants awaiting their hearings watched in stunned disbelief. And court staff who'd worked alongside Judge Rouse for years struggled to process what they were witnessing. As handcuffs were placed on her wrists, she maintained rigid composure except for a slight tremor in her hands. that betrayed the psychological earthquake happening beneath that controlled exterior. The perp walk through the courthouse hallways became an impromptu gauntlet of former colleagues, defense attorneys who'd argued before her, prosecutors who'd won convictions in her courtroom, all watching in silence as she was led past courtroom after courtroom where justice was supposed to be served, not perverted. The booking process at Central Processing stripped away every layer of authority she'd accumulated over decades. The crimson blazer was replaced with a standard-issue yellow jumpsuit. Her jewelry was cataloged and placed in a property bag, and the mugshot captured a woman whose mask was beginning to crack. That photograph would become one of the most circulated images in the case, the stern judicial features now devoid of the commanding presence she'd projected from the bench, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. As if she genuinely couldn't comprehend how she'd ended up on this side of the criminal justice system. The interrogation room, where Hendricks and her partner Detective Ramsey questioned Judge Rouse for 9 hours, was deliberately chosen. A windowless space with uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look exhausted and guilty. Judge Rouse's interrogation strategy revealed everything about how her legal mind worked under pressure. She treated it like a chess match, where she believed she could outmaneuver detectives who'd spent their entire careers getting confessions from people far less sophisticated than a sitting judge. Her opening move was to question the validity of the warrant itself, demanding to see the affidavit and pointing out what she claimed were procedural deficiencies that would render any statements she made inadmissible. Detective Hendricks let her run through this performance for 20 minutes before calmly explaining that federal judges don't make rookie mistakes and that her legal expertise wasn't going to create the loopholes she was searching for. When it became clear that procedural challenges weren't going to work, Judge Rouse shifted to outright denial with the confidence of someone who'd watched thousands of defendants lie and thought she could do it better. She claimed the journal was fiction, research for a crime novel she'd been writing about judicial corruption, a creative outlet for the frustrations every judge feels when technicalities let dangerous people walk free. The offshore account was legitimate retirement planning, she insisted, and the consulting fees were payment for expert witness work she'd been doing for out-of-state law firms. Her explanation for the surveillance equipment was even more creative. She claimed she'd been collecting evidence of courthouse security vulnerabilities to present to the Judicial Oversight Committee, essentially arguing she'd been conducting an unofficial investigation to improve safety. But then Hendricks laid out the crime scene photos, the autopsy reports, and most damaging of all, the hexafluoroisopropanol evidence that connected the courthouse preservation lab directly to 7 dead bodies. Judge Rouse's composure began fracturing like ice under pressure. Her breathing became shallow, her hands started trembling despite her attempts to keep them still on the table, and her responses grew more defensive and less coherent. When Hendricks read aloud from the journal, "I am the last line of defense between evil and society," Judge Rouse's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. She stood up so violently her chair toppled backward, hands grabbing her head in a gesture of complete psychological breakdown. And for the first time since her arrest, the mask slipped to reveal something raw and terrifying underneath. What came out of her mouth next wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was close enough to devastate any defense her attorneys would later try to mount. She began shouting about how the system was broken, how constitutional protections had become shields for predators, how she'd watched guilty people walk free on technicalities, while victims and their families sat in her courtroom, begging for justice she couldn't legally deliver. She'd taken an oath to uphold the law, she screamed. But what good was the law when it protected the guilty more than the innocent? Every word was being recorded, every gesture captured on video, and her defense team would spend months trying unsuccessfully to have this outburst suppressed as evidence of a psychological break rather than consciousness of guilt. The trial of Judge Irma Rose became the kind of media spectacle that brings out the worst in cable news coverage and the best in serious legal journalism. Selecting an impartial jury seemed nearly impossible. How do you find 12 citizens who haven't formed opinions about a judge accused of becoming a serial killer? The voir dire process stretched for 3 weeks as potential jurors were questioned about their views on judicial authority, vigilante justice, and whether they could separate their feelings about defendants who'd committed crimes from the fundamental principle that nobody has the right to execute them without due process. Defense attorney Marcus Blackwell used every challenge he had to eliminate anyone with law enforcement connections, while prosecutor Sarah Chen systematically removed anyone who showed even a hint of sympathy for Judge Rouse's frustration with the system's limitations. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, built around that foundational clue of hexafluoroisopropanol that connected every crime scene directly to the courthouse. Forensic chemist Dr. Angela Martinez spent an entire day on the witness stand, explaining how this rare industrial solvent became the thread that unraveled Judge Rouse's carefully planned murders. She demonstrated for the jury exactly how transfer works, how someone handling documents treated with this chemical would carry microscopic traces on their clothing and gloves, traces that would then be deposited at crime scenes through physical contact with victims or their belongings. The defense tried to argue contamination or coincidence, but Martinez's testimony was airtight. The concentration patterns and distribution were consistent with deliberate transfer from a primary source, namely the courthouse preservation lab that security footage showed Judge Rouse accessing 43 times. The journal entries were read aloud in court, each one more chilling than the last. Prosecutors projected pages onto screens so the jury could see Judge Rouse's handwriting documenting her victims' crimes against morality, with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to legal opinions. Former law clerk Patricia Morrison testified through tears about disturbing conversations, where Judge Rouse had said things like, "Some people don't deserve the Constitution's protection," and "There's a difference between legal justice and true justice." Morrison admitted she'd dismissed these comments as the venting of an overworked judge frustrated with the system, never imagining they were the philosophy of someone planning to become judge, jury, and executioner. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from the prosecution's psychological expert, Dr. Raymond Foster, who'd conducted extensive interviews with Judge Rouse and reviewed decades of her judicial rulings. He testified about what he called judicial God complex, a psychological condition that can develop in judges who spend years making life-altering decisions and gradually begin to believe their judgment is superior to the laws they're sworn to uphold. He explained how Judge Rouse's increasing frustration with acquittals and dismissed charges had metastasized into a belief that she alone could deliver real justice. A compartmentalization so complete that she could preside over trials by day and plan murders by night without experiencing cognitive dissonance. The jury deliberated for 7 hours, and every minute felt like an eternity for the packed courtroom where legal professionals, victims' family members, and media representatives waited in tense silence. When the court clerk finally announced that a verdict had been reached, Judge Silas Linnane, the man who'd once called Irma Rose his mentor, returned to the bench with a gravity that made it clear he understood the historical weight of this moment. As the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, you could hear people holding their breath throughout the gallery. Guilty on count 1, first-degree murder. Guilty on count 2, guilty on count 3. By the time they reached count 7, Judge Rouse's famous composure had completely disintegrated into the image we showed you at the beginning. Hands clutching her head, eyes wide with an expression somewhere between horror and disbelief, as if she genuinely couldn't comprehend that the legal system she'd manipulated for 3 years had ultimately held her accountable. Her outburst was immediate and uncontrolled. nothing like the measured judicial voice she'd used for 25 years. She screamed at the jury that they didn't understand, that she'd done what none of them had the courage to do, that the 7 people she'd killed were predators who didn't deserve the mercy the law had given them. Bailiffs moved quickly to restrain her as she continued shouting about how the system was protecting the guilty and punishing those brave enough to deliver real justice. Judge Lenine gavelled the courtroom to order with tears visible in his eyes, and as Judge Roos was led away, still ranting about her victim's crimes, everyone present understood they'd witnessed something unprecedented. A complete psychological breakdown of someone who'd believed herself above the law she'd sworn to uphold. The reactions across the city reflected the complicated emotions this case had stirred up. In legal circles, there was relief that the system had worked even when investigating one of its own, but also deep discomfort about how long Judge Roos had operated undetected. Defense attorneys who'd appeared before her began reviewing old cases, wondering if other defendants might have faced extrajudicial consequences nobody had connected to the stern woman in the crimson blazer. Prosecutors questioned whether they'd missed warning signs of her increasing extremism. Those moments when her frustration with acquittals seemed to cross from professional disappointment into something darker and more personal. Victims' families experienced a range of emotions that complicated the traditional narrative of justice served. Marcus Webb's sister stood outside the courthouse and told reporters that yes, her brother had problems and had hurt people, but nobody had the right to execute him without trial. The wife of the domestic abuser Judge Roos had killed gave an interview saying she'd wanted her husband held accountable through the legal system, not murdered by a vigilante judge who'd appointed herself as executioner. Perhaps most poignant was the statement from a victim who'd actually been innocent. A defendant whose charges were eventually dismissed after the real perpetrator was found, but who'd been on Judge Rouse's surveillance list anyway, saved from murder only by the timing of his exoneration. The sentencing hearing brought Judge Silas Linane face to face with the most painful duty of his career, condemning the mentor who'd shaped his understanding of judicial responsibility. Victim impact statements filled an entire afternoon with raw testimony that forced everyone present to confront the human cost of Judge Roos's vigilante crusade. Marcus Webb's sister described her brother's struggles with addiction and violence, but insisted he'd been trying to change before someone decided he didn't deserve that chance. The mother of a domestic abuse victim testified that while her daughter's abuser had escaped adequate punishment through a plea deal, his murder hadn't brought healing, only more trauma and the disturbing knowledge that a judge had appointed herself executioner. When Judge Rouse was given her final opportunity to address the court, she remained unrepentant, delivering what sounded more like a legal brief than a plea for mercy. She challenged the constitutionality of her conviction, questioned the chain of custody for key evidence, and maintained she'd been performing a necessary function the system refused to acknowledge. Judge Linane's sentencing was delivered with measured sorrow. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole on all 7 counts to be served consecutively. As corrections officers led her away, that crimson blazer now replaced permanently by prison gray. The legal community began the difficult work of understanding how they'd missed the warning signs of a judge descending into murderous delusion. What do you think about Judge Irma Rouse's belief that she was correcting the justice system's failures? Can frustration with legal technicalities ever justify vigilante murder? And should Judge Linane have recognized the warning signs earlier in his mentor's growing extremism? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about where justice ends and vengeance begins. If you're still here, you're exactly who we need in this community. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we're building something powerful. A community unafraid to expose corruption at the highest levels. Every subscription helps us bring you more shocking cases like this one, stories the mainstream media won't touch. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Turn on notifications and join us in proving that nobody is above the law. I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's even more unbelievable. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about where justice ends and vengeance begins. If you're still here, you're exactly who we need in this community. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we're building something powerful. A community unafraid to expose corruption at the highest levels. Every subscription helps us bring you more shocking cases like this one. Stories the mainstream media won't touch. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Turn on notifications and join us in proving that nobody is above the law. I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's even more unbelievable.